Hi, I'm DC Breaks and I'm here at DBS Institute for Industry Week, and I'm going to be talking about my career as a DJ and producer and how I've developed a number of different revenue streams working in the music industry. I'm here to talk about my career outside of DBS, which is as the drum bass producer DJ DC Breaks, which I've been doing for about 20 years or so now. And in that time, I've had the good fortune of working in lots of different areas of the industry, and that's what you might end up calling a portfolio career. So basically just having different revenue streams, and that's really the kind of focus of this session. And it's something that a lot of people end up having, because I think as sort of creative people, we tend to be quite entrepreneurial and kind of interested in different things. And it's just a good thing for, because it can be quite hard and risky to survive on just, income from DJing or whatever your thing is. And so diversifying can really help maintain your career, and that was certainly the case for myself. And so when I was kind of asked to do this, I was kind of reflecting back on how my career kind of panned out and how it kind of developed. And the thing that really struck me was how when you start working in different areas, you pick up new skills, and that opens doors and opportunities to work in different areas. And that can also kind of reinforce the skills that you have in some of the core activities that you might spend your time doing when you're working in the industry. So here I am as in my early 20s. This is my business partner, Dan. He's the other guy in DC Breaks. And through my career, I started obviously out as like an amateur DJ, like many of you may have started out in the industry yourselves. But since then, I've kind of developed income streams around DJing, also producing, radio, sync licensing. We'll talk about a bit of that a bit later on. And so with each of these things, like e-commerce, developing an online web store and things like that, later on we can go into a bit more detail about how all these things kind of came about for myself. Also merchandising, freelancing, sound design, content creation, and finally here at DBS in education. And so, yeah, just to kind of go over this point that when you start learning and working in different areas of the industry, that can help you develop new revenue streams. And that's really how it came about for myself. So I kind of put together, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about a kind of a mind map that I put together of how my career progressed, to give you an idea about some of the things that I've done in terms of how the skills in one area kind of led through to another. So I don't know if anyone here kind of got into music through, or electronic music through DJing. That was certainly the case for myself back in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And for me, like learning to kind of mix two records together and then kind of getting out there doing some shows, learning about live performance. And certainly when you're a DJ, you have to kind of keep up with technology. So I started out as a vinyl DJ. Then obviously along came CDJs, MP3 players, and technology is always moving very quickly. So that's kind of a skill, learning about tempo and EQ and track structure. And much later on in my career, key mixing, or mixing in key, was kind of a skill I developed. And networking. Networking is really a skill that I think sometimes you might not have, but it's certainly a skill you can develop. And it's really important throughout your career to kind of have that skill to be able to meet people, get on with them. And often that's how you get into different areas of the industry and pick up work as well. So for me, starting out as a DJ, I kind of quickly realized that if I wanted to get better known, get bigger shows, get more money, the thing I would need to do would be to start making music. And it's not rocket science. I guess it's something that probably you're all here to do. But doing that would then it kind of gives you skills in other areas. So from being a DJ and just knowing about sort of mixing and making tunes, you then get into producing and you start learning about how tunes are put together at a more fundamental level. You get to grips with new technology, different sort of computer systems, software. You learn about, again, some of these are sort of correlated, so tempo, working at different speeds and how that can affect your production decisions. Collaborating, so vast majority of my career kind of worked with other producers. I do kind of make some music by myself, but most of the time I work with other people. So yeah, all these kinds of things that you pick up have a beneficial sort of relationship back to the thing you started doing, so in this case, DJing. And and from a revenue point of view, in terms of monetizing your skill set, you now have another way of making money, and it makes you a bit more resilient. So you're not just making money as a DJ, you're maybe starting to collect some royalties, And going through that process, you learn about things like PROs, royalty collection societies, and how royalties work and things like that as well. So from there, for me at least, the next step was to get some records out there, because there's no point having, well, it was great making music and it can make your DJ sets better, but ultimately you want to try and get signed to a label perhaps. When I was initially sort of starting out, there wasn't really the opportunity to self-release music. That wasn't really like an option like it is now, but the main thing was to try and get signed. And for me, that was a way of really marketing my music. So going through that process of initially signing with a very small label and then working up through to bigger labels and eventually signing with a major, you kind of get familiar with contracts. So this was kind of my first experience of anything legal and kind of contracts was, starting out by working with record labels and kind of finding out how a legal process gets put in place to essentially just mark out what your responsibilities are and what the label's responsibilities are. And we'll go into this in more detail later, but how sometimes the thing that you think you're doing with a contract doesn't necessarily work out in that way in the real world. So a big part of what I want to kind of talk about is my real world experience of how all this stuff comes together, because it isn't necessarily how you learn about it when you're kind of in the classroom. So just other things there, like deadlines. When you start making music for a record label, you might have deadlines to kind of commit to. That can be tricky sometimes as a creative person if you just like making music, but suddenly, the release schedule's there. You've got to hit a certain time to get your music out on time, things like that, and professionalism and responsibility. Just things like when you have a recording contract, you have to provide what are called warranties. So that's essentially a promise that you're not including copyright material, samples, things like that. That can have a big impact on your career, if you get that wrong, for example. And also you start to, and certainly I did start to get a feel for how the industry works in terms of how music is manufactured and distributed and marketed. And again, of course, there can be revenue streams to be had from signing contracts if there's advances and things, which I don't think there is a huge amount of that anymore. But the landscape's shifted a lot in the last 20 odd years. But certainly it's another thing that also then feeds back to you, or in my case, as a DJ, being able to get bigger shows, better shows, and kind of starting to get out there as an artist. So from there, something else that we can talk about is marketing. So for me, the music was a form of marketing myself as a DJ, really. That was the kind of the way I was coming about it. And it wasn't until I started working with record labels that I realized that there's a lot more to it than just that. So releasing music is really the start, but then at the time, the main way of marketing your music was through DJs playing it, radio play, doing kind of mixtapes, recorded mixes, and performances as well. Getting out there and doing shows, the more shows you can get, that's effectively you marketing yourself as an artist. And of course, things like interviews, PR. So at the time, when I first started out, there wasn't social media, there wasn't YouTube. It was literally print mags, things like Knowledge Magazine, you might know. For drum and bass at least, and then much later music videos and social media, which we'll come to again in more detail. But the point, if I'm not ramming it home too much, is that this then has a benefit back to becoming a DJ, and I wouldn't have got through and wouldn't have learned about all these things if I hadn't started getting out into the industry, making tunes, getting them signed, and kind of going through that process. So a big part of my early career that was successful for me was getting into radio. And that really came about through, and I'll go through the kind of the sort of chain of events that kind of led to me kind of getting signed to bigger labels later. But for me, it was about getting my tunes on kind of national radio. So having people like Fabian Grooverider, who had the main drum and bass show at the time, playing my records was a great way of marketing myself. And through doing that, kind of got to know who the producers of the Radio 1 shows were. And then through that, being able to organize like guest mixes or even like short telephone interviews and stuff like that to promote yourself as an artist and to kind of start to establish a bit of a story around yourself. It's not just a producer making tunes, but who you are, what your kind of story is, and starting to develop a bit of a profile and a brand for yourself. And that ended up leading to me doing some live broadcasts with radio, and also presenting on BBC Radio 1 and 1 Extra. And again, that was a great way of putting myself out there and marketing myself as a producer and a DJ. And of course, there's different revenue streams to be had from that. So I was getting paid to present on the radio, but then of course, the more your tracks are getting played on the radio, you're able to collect royalties as well. So going through that process, you then start to learn about, okay, well, how much money could I potentially make from having a track played on Radio 1, and learning about how the audience figures and things like that feed through to determining how much you're actually going to generate in revenue. And again, kicking back, you then start finding, okay, well now I'm getting more bookings through DJing because more people know about me. So something else that we can touch on is licensing, and really sort of two sides of this. And for me, all of the licensing stuff I've done has really come through record labels, generally speaking. And so there's, I guess, on the one hand, having a track synced to something on TV. For example, I've had tracks on like Match of the Day or The Only Way is Essex, if anybody watches that. I don't know, probably not. And so, yeah, so that's quite a straightforward process. The record label, you know, pretty much gets the inquiry. They want the tune, it goes out, you get paid. It's, you know, fairly straightforward. But then there's also been times when, as a signed artist in a recording agreement, my work has been licensed, or I've been commissioned to create music for a third party. So some examples we can talk about later is music I've made for Disney, for example, also the Fast and Furious franchise that I made some music for, and kind of how that came about. And then going through that process, kind of learning what it's like to work to a client's brief, which can be quite complicated, as we'll see. Working in different genres, so you know the vast majority of music I've made has been drum and bass, but sometimes when you're working for a client, they might not necessarily want that, and so that can kind of help diversify your skills as a producer to work in different areas. And then yeah, learning about the industry from a different perspective, so looking at it from a computer game perspective and how it might work from the sort of their side in terms of licensing your music. So there's quite a complicated setup there with having to clear the sync license and also the master license. We can talk about that in a bit more detail later on. Again, networking, different aspects of legal, so similar to recording agreements in some ways, some of the language and clauses are the same. And of course, it's another revenue stream that you can develop. And what I would say about all these different things is that, you know, I've kind of dipped my toe into a lot of these, and you may find the same thing when you kind of go through your careers, but when you have a portfolio career, you don't always necessarily, you might try something and it might not work. So for me, freelancing is something I've tried a bit of, doesn't really work for me, but for some people that's like their main thing. And yeah, you kind of have this ability, if you kind of go through your career in this way, to kind of see what works for you, and then if you really like working in a particular area, kind of go, well, that's great, and I'll kind of do more of that. I'd love to do more licensing. There's a lot of there's quite a lot of money to be made in licensing. Some of the figures are quite good, but it's also quite hard work to get into, and it's quite competitive as well. So another big part of my career, certainly in the last 5 years, has been developing an online store, dcbreaks.com/shop. And in kind of doing that, initially the rationale for doing that was to just build an artist website. So it's to give myself a placeholder online for DC Breaks, for really kind of just access to news, releases, music and stuff like that. But yeah, I think I've been doing it about 5 or 6 years now. The idea then was to obviously try and sell some audio products to help diversify my revenue stream. And so for me, that was mainly sample packs, synth preset packs, and then more recently, a plugin that I developed with Dan as well called Halo, which we'll talk about. And so in going through that process, I learned about web design. I developed the website myself, learning about graphic design, and then yeah, kind of sales and marketing of products, online digital products, designing those products. Also some experience in merchandising, which you can talk about a little bit. That can be another sort of revenue stream. And then kind of building or having brand awareness, because I think a lot of the time we're just focused on making music and kind of whatever genre or subgenre that may be. But there's a lot more to yourself as an artist when it comes to your people's perception of you, how your brand fits together, and it's all sorts of things, not just like, you know, the logo used and the fonts and the colors and all that kind of stuff has to have a kind of cohesive feel. And so at different times in my career, I've had sort of different logos, and it's been a bit all over the place, and, you know, not necessarily a cohesive brand image. So when I came to do the website, I was like, right, okay, we've got to kind of pull it all together. It's all got to kind of match up and be kind of cohesive with what I'm trying to, you know, establish my brand as. And then, yeah, just lastly, legal. So with e-commerce, it's things like GDPR compliance, which is not very exciting, but really important if you want to have a legally compliant website. So that's just like data protection for your customers' data and things like that. And I think, if I'd gone from being a DJ and then straight into e-commerce, I might not have necessarily had all the experience of sort of working with contracts in a legal capacity, signing record deals or licensing and things. So all of these kind of things I've done up to this point fed through to me having a better understanding of how to approach these sort of issues when I tried something new like e-commerce, for example. So something else I've done a lot of in my career is sound design, both as a producer, obviously making my own music, but also monetizing that by designing products to a client brief. So 2 examples would be Sample Genie, if anybody knows Sample Genie, who I think are based in Bristol actually, who offer a sort of subscription product for their customers where they can see tutorial videos by established producers and also then have a sample pack and things from that producer. So I've worked for them, and also like Splice, putting together a sample pack for Splice. I can talk about that. And so again, working to a client's brief. But for me, I think one of the skills that was key about doing that, particularly for Sample Genie, because it was quite a while ago now, was learning about video creation and designing tutorial style content. And I think that's a really good skill to have. It's also one of the things that we use to assess our advanced MP students for their submissions, is to get them to design videos. Because even though they're working in electronic music production, having the ability to develop great video content is really useful for working for corporate clients like that, or for for me, kind of designing videos to promote like tracks or products. Obviously, Patreon is quite a key thing now that a lot of people use to kind of make money, but also educate their followers. That wasn't around when I kind of started out, but that's like a really good skill to have, essentially. And kind of ultimately, one of the things that got me into working with DBS was having a certain level of video content skill. So that's pretty key. We could talk about that. And yeah, again, working different genres. It's another source of revenue. Certainly for someone like Splice, it's relatively straightforward. It's just about creating a certain product, a certain specification. But that can be kind of a good revenue stream as well. Sometimes they'll pay advances, but there's also royalties you can collect on that as well. And again, legal. And once again, all of this kind of feeds back into different areas of your career that can be beneficial. So learning sound design to a really high level has improved my ability as a producer and has allowed me to make better products, which then helps obviously increase the sort of value of those products, and more people buy them and make a bit more cash. So social media, I think there's a good reason why a lot of people kind of outsource social media management to companies, because it's a really complicated thing to do well, and it's ever changing. But for the reality for a lot of people, myself included, is that you just have to get to grips with it. It's just something you have to do now if you want to have a presence online, for better or worse. But kind of getting to grips with that could be something that you end up doing and monetizing for other people, managing other people's profiles. There are quite a few relatively small companies of people who work in the industry, really get social media, have a great way of creating engaging content and doing all that stuff. And so you can monetize that skill and sell it to other people. It's not something that I've done for other people, but for myself, it's helped to drive sales through creating sort of, for me, it was kind of silly, humorous videos around my products to kind of get that engagement. But then once you kind of delve into it, there's all the analytics you can get from social media, which can help inform what kind of products you design, how you market those, where you market them. You can use that data for optimizing advertising, so you can run different advertising campaigns, A/B test them, and use that data at quite a granular level to focus how you market your products, and do things like data capture, email data capture, and how you kind of start building up a customer base as well. And again, numerous benefits back to all these different areas as well. So freelancing, I mentioned it briefly. For me, my experience in freelancing was really just a case of trying it, seeing if it was something that would end up paying quite well, or at least being something I could use to generate revenue. And the process was really me kind of going through LinkedIn, trying to find local businesses who I thought might need someone to compose music for them on a bespoke basis. And there were a lot of like, no, this is irrelevant, you're wasting time, what are you doing? But eventually found a few people who were like, oh yes, actually we do need some work. And then so kind of going through that process of trying to find the right companies, generate leads, follow up on them, and end up getting some paid work. For me, it was a bit too much like hassle for the amount of money involved, so I didn't really pursue it. But it was a useful exercise to go through, and again, can be another revenue stream and a networking opportunity, and more experience of working to a client brief, particularly if it's music outside of the genre you're most familiar with. So we're nearly there. Just on this point about education, I think it's really useful from a lot of different perspectives. I think one thing I found working at DBS is having to learn about a subject to enough detail to feel like I could teach it. It was a great way of learning the subject yourself at a much deeper level. And so a lot of the skills that I've learned through working at DBS have benefited my ability as a producer. And there's been a lot of mutual benefits for me working here, as well as maintaining my music career. And I guess one of the reasons I ended up working at DBS was because during the pandemic, my income from live dried up overnight. Luckily, I had some other revenue streams to kind of keep me ticking over. But with 2 young kids and a house and all the rest of it, it made sense for me to move into paid employment. And I've actually had some kind of sort of informal employment for probably my entire career, with about the exception of 4 or 5 years when I've done music full time. And some people, just do music full time, and that's great. But the majority of people, realistically, who work in industry, have different revenue streams like this to help them kind of keep going and working in the music industry as well. Just the last thing then to mention is the plugin that I helped develop with Dan, which is a plugin called Halo. And so going through that process, again, it was a bit of a pandemic project. We had a bit more time on our hands to kind of try something new and learn some new skills, explore some new technology, which again, having kind of moved through from just understanding about how to mix 2 tunes together through learning different DAWs and all this kind of different software that goes with all this kind of different stuff. I think that in a way helps if you learn how to kind of use new technology and get into sort of, just using different types of software. It makes you a bit more able to pick up new skills in things like coding and stuff, which is not something either of us had done before. And again, further, more in-depth sound design knowledge, and ideally, which is the main reason, a revenue stream as well. So hopefully that kind of vaguely makes sense. I know it looks like a bit of a dog stint, but the point is that, if I hadn't started producing and hadn't got signed, then a lot of these other things wouldn't necessarily have come about. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to learn more about what it's like to work in the music industry, subscribe to the DBS channel now.